Off the coast of Sicily in the summer of 1902, a geologist named Dorothea Bate crawled through a limestone cave and found something that refused to make sense. The bones were unmistakably elephant. The domed skull, the flared depressions where ears had once attached, the ridged grinding surfaces of molar teeth. She had studied enough proboscidean fossils to be certain, but the size was wrong, catastrophically wrong. The animal she was piecing together had stood roughly 90 centimeters at the shoulder, its entire skull fit, with room to spare, inside a large suitcase. A fully grown adult elephant with permanent teeth, sealed growth plates, a skeleton that had run its full developmental course, weighing perhaps 200 kilograms. On the mainland, its direct ancestor had weighed 8 tons. Bate published. She named the species Paleoloxodon falconeri, and spent years defending the argument that this was not a juvenile, not a freak, not a pathological specimen. It was a normal adult. The island had made it this way. Nobody believed her for 30 years. They should have believed her immediately, because what happened on Sicily was not a local anomaly. It was a glimpse of a principle operating quietly on every isolated landmass on Earth, one that reverses, compresses, and rewrites the evolutionary rules that the mainland spent hundreds of millions of years constructing. What is the island rule? Why does isolation shrink elephants and grow rats? And why does the answer to both questions begin with the same word, pressure? The island rule was named and formalized in 1964 by a Canadian ecologist named Bristol Foster. He had spent years compiling measurements of island mammals from archives around the world, and the pattern he found was consistent enough to feel like physics. Large mammals, anything above a rough threshold of body mass, shrank on islands. Small mammals grew. The direction of change depended almost entirely on the animal's starting size. Foster described it as a rule because it wasn't a tendency, it was close to a law. The mechanism begins with what an island actually is. An island is a closed system with a ceiling. Resources are finite, fixed, and unable to be supplemented by migration. There are no backup ranges, no adjacent valleys to move into during drought. Every calorie that exists on the island today is approximately every calorie that will exist on the island tomorrow, and every animal competing for those calories is locked into that competition with no exit. Under those conditions, a smaller body becomes a survival advantage that compounds across thousands of generations. A smaller elephant needs less food. A smaller elephant survives a bad season that would kill a full-sized one. It reproduces at lower caloric cost, reaches maturity earlier, and leaves more offspring in lean years. The island does not select against large size out of hostility. It selects against large size because maintaining it costs more than the environment will pay. But resource pressure alone does not explain the full picture. On the mainland, large body size serves a function that has nothing to do with food. It is armor. An 8-ton elephant has no natural predators because nothing large enough to threaten one has ever evolved on the same landscape. Size is defense, accumulated across evolutionary time in direct response to the predators that once existed. When a founding population reaches an island, typically by swimming or crossing land bridges that later flooded, it often arrives without those predators. The selective pressure that made large size necessary simply does not exist. The body can shrink. The calories saved compound into fitness. Over enough generations, the giant is gone. The Mediterranean documented this process on a scale almost impossible to absorb. Paleoloxodon falconeri on Sicily and Malta. A separate dwarf species on Cyprus, on Crete, on several of the Cyclades. Each island evolved its own miniature elephant independently, in isolation, across hundreds of thousands of years. The smallest, found on Malta, stood barely taller than a large dog and weighed less than an adult human. Its ancestor was one of the largest terrestrial mammals that had ever walked the Earth. The Channel Islands of California preserved a parallel experiment on the other side of the world. Columbian mammoths, animals that weighed up to 10 tons on the mainland, crossed to the islands during the last glacial maximum when lower sea levels made the journey possible. They were stranded when the seas rose. The pygmy mammoth of Santa Rosa Island, Mammoths exilis, eventually stabilized at roughly 1.4 meters tall, retaining every physical feature of its towering ancestor in the body of a large cow. And in the Arctic Ocean, on Wrangel Island, a remnant population of woolly mammoths persisted completely isolated until approximately 4,000 years ago, shrinking steadily across the millennia. When the last Wrangel mammoths died, the Egyptian pyramids had already been standing for 3 centuries. The island rule does not operate in one direction. When small animals reach islands without predators, the same logic inverts. A rodent arriving on an island where nothing hunts rodents faces an environment of abundance with no selection pressure for the compact, agile body that helped its mainland ancestors evade predators. The Flores giant rat grew to roughly 4 times the body mass of its closest Asian relatives. The Sardinian pika reached sizes approaching a small rabbit. The dodo, derived from a pigeon-like ancestor, arrived on Mauritius and, across millions of years of isolation from predators, grew to weigh roughly 20 kilograms and shed the ability to fly entirely. Flight is metabolically expensive. It requires hollow bones, reduced organ mass, and a continuous caloric investment simply to maintain the musculature that makes it possible. On an island without predators, flight is also unnecessary. The dodo did not become flightless because it forgot how. It became flightless because the island made flight a waste. The Komodo dragon, still alive today on the islands of Flores Komodo and Rinca, represents a third direction entirely. Genetic evidence suggests it descended from mainland Australian monitor lizards and reached the Indonesian islands several million years ago. The absence of large mammalian predators on those islands left an ecological role unfilled. The dragon grew into it. At up to 3 meters long and 90 kilograms, it became the apex predator of its ecosystem, a lizard occupying the niche that a lion or a tiger would hold on the mainland. The island had no lion, so it built one out of a reptile. The most disturbing case in the entire record of island evolution was announced in 2003 after excavations on the Indonesian island of Flores. The bones belonged to a hominid, not a great ape, a member of the human family. The skeleton stood roughly 1 meter tall. The brain case held a volume approximately 1/3 the size of a modern human skull. The teeth showed wear consistent with omnivory. The hands showed adaptations for tool use. Scattered around the bones were stone tools, flakes and cores requiring coordinated planning and group behavior to produce. The species was named Homo floresiensis. It survived on Flores until at least 50,000 years ago, possibly as recently as 12,000. Its most likely ancestor was Homo erectus, a mainland hominid of fully modern height with a brain approaching modern volume. The island had miniaturized it across perhaps 1 million years of isolation. A brain 1/3 the size should have meant cognitive capacity, roughly proportional to that reduction. Fewer neurons, less processing power, simpler behavior. But the tools found alongside Homo floresiensis do not suggest a cognitively diminished species. They suggest a species that hunted in organized groups, managed fire, and planned actions with delayed consequences. How an island-dwarfed brain maintained the functional complexity of a much larger one is a question neuroscience has not yet resolved. The island laboratory operates on one condition, that the island stays closed. The evolutionary machinery that produces dwarfism and gigantism moves across tens of thousands of generations. It requires isolation, stability, and time measured in geological periods, not human lifetimes. What it cannot survive is sudden contact with the world outside. When humans reached the Mediterranean roughly 12,000 years ago, the dwarf elephants of Cyprus vanished within centuries of the first stone tools appearing in the archaeological record. The pygmy mammoths of the Channel Islands disappeared within a geological instant of the first evidence of human presence on those islands. The dodo survived less than a century of sustained contact after Dutch sailors arrived on Mauritius in 1638. Homo floresiensis left its last confirmed traces in the sediment within a few thousand years of modern humans reaching Flores. The laboratory does not survive being opened. What remains is a record in fossilized bone, in eroded sediment, in the living bodies of tortoises and dragons still holding their islands, of what life does when it is left alone long enough to forget the mainland. Size is not a fixed property of a species. It is a negotiation between a body and the resources available to it, between a lineage and the predators that once shaped it, between what an animal was and what the island now needs it to become. The elephant that stood 90 centimeters tall was not a smaller version of an elephant. It was a different answer to the same question the mainland had already answered. And across the Mediterranean, the Pacific, the Indian Ocean and the Arctic Sea, islands asked that question hundreds of times and received hundreds of different answers. Every one of them was correct for exactly as long as the island held.